We completed our detailed study of the text titled Sri Aurobindo Upanishad, where Sri Aurobindo leads us to the vision of the universe as a manifestation of the divine delight intended to express his play in the world, and we to ourselves as children of that bliss are intended to enjoy that bliss and enjoy him in all things. And this being the basis of all our future efforts, we turned briefly to look at the philosophical question that Sri Aurobindo deals with, the question which is intractable in modern philosophy, of how or why a divine which is himself an eternal bliss can manifest a world which is a domain of pain and suffering, even of falsehood and evil. We are studying 2 chapters from the Life Divine where Sri Aurobindo deals with this problem. And in the first chapter, titled The Delight of Existence, the Problem, he reviews the question itself and restates the question. And we saw that the question changes entirely when we stop looking at the divine as a person sitting outside the cosmos. As long as he is a person sitting outside, then he is obviously perverse to allow a universe which has so much evil and suffering. But when we view the universe itself as a manifestation of the divine, and the divine immanent in the universe, himself upholding and bearing the pain and suffering that we experience, then the question changes. And now the question becomes, how is it that one who is all bliss, all good, all beauty and all joy can choose to manifest himself as a universe in which this opposite condition of pain and suffering can exist? And this question now is taken up not only of how it's possible, but why he allows it, because after all, he being omnipotent can choose to create a universe in which these things would not exist. When we began the second chapter, Delight of Existence, the solution, Sri Aurobindo placed before us a triple vision of the universe, where at the same time, this world which we see in its obvious form as a movement of force is in fact, to a deeper perception, an expression of a creative consciousness throwing out of itself infinite possibility, infinite potential of its being. And behind that is the infinite delight which is ever busy with drawing out these possibilities and manifesting them. We have to see the universe from this triple view to understand this whole question clearly. In the immediate next portion, Sri Aurobindo discussed the nature of the human experience. First he says, if the nature of this universe is that the infinite bliss is deep within, throwing out these forms and appearances, the same is true also of us. We, as individuals, are in our deepest foundations one with and a part of that ocean of bliss. But on the surface of our personal experience is this throwing up of various forms and ripples on the surface. Our real self is deep within, and it is not mental. The person that we experience ourselves to be is this surface ripple, which is the mental being. And when we see that this is the reality of our own experience, our own existence, there are 2 very great consequences which emerge. The first consequence is that this experience, triple experience of pain, pleasure, and indifference, is only part of the waking surface consciousness. And there also, it is a habitual part. Behind, in those deeper, vaster, truer domains of our own existence, there is a consciousness which is taking delight impartially in all experiences. While the surface being may suffer in pain or exult in joy or excitement, that inner depth of the true being is equally enjoying both from its delight. The surface person, agitated, is not conscious of this deeper, truer person. But what really happens, unknown to us, is whatever the surface reaction, it percolates down to that inner, truer person, where it is absorbed very differently. Even what on the surface is felt as pain or suffering is absorbed within as an aspect of the delight, and out of that deeper dimension of ourselves, a response is put forward. And that response emerges in us in the form of strength, growth of character, knowledge, and some impulsion whose origins, whose roots we are not conscious of. And we just find that often in the worst crises of our life, we find an extraordinary inner strength emerging from where we do not know. How it came at that time, we do not understand. Where it withdraws into after the crisis has passed, we are not conscious. But that inner strength comes forward, that power of our being, character, even sometimes a joyous response to the challenges of the world are seen coming from deep within always. So this deeper dimension are unknown to us because our mind is habituated to playing on the surface. And we saw that the first thing that we need to do to be able to become aware of that deeper dimension is to train the mind to concentrate itself, to turn inwards, and learn to live in the depths. In our ordinary life as we are lost on the surface. We are not even conscious that there is a deeper dimension to ourselves. And it needs a moment of pause to turn in and begin to explore this inner dimension. And as we move into it, we discover that within is the Lord Himself or His radiance, and we discover that deep inside us, we are in fact one with that, the one who enjoys this universe. Sri Aurobindo reminds us of the very expressive Sanskrit term that there is the Anandamaya behind the Manomaya. Manomaya is the mental being, behind that is the bliss being, the bliss consciousness. And the truth of ourselves lies within and not on the surface. So this is the first consequence of recognizing our true character. The second consequence is this, that from that inner poise we may remain detached and remain in a perhaps inner bliss while the outer being may still continue to suffer. But the second consequence is that this outer response, our habitual response of our outer nature, has itself no absoluteness and no necessity. It is merely a pattern of habit. If I experience a sharp point pressing on my finger, I register it as pain and I react in a scream of suffering. Why? I never thought about it. As a child, it happened to me automatically, and I grew into that habit. But as an adult, I find myself stung by a bee, and instead of reacting as I would as a child and howling and screaming, I look around and say, oh, I don't need to scream. And I withhold that habitual reaction. And then I concentrate on what I need to do to get rid of this problem. And I move on to solving it. How could I do that? There is obviously some part of my personality which is not bound to that habit, which can impose itself and change that habit. And if that habit can be changed in one small example, why cannot it be changed in everything? So Sri Aurobindo looks at this second great consequence of our deeper understanding, and he says that we feel pleasure or pain in a particular contact because that is the habit our nature has formed. Because that is the constant relation the recipient has established with the contact. Now we can go back and say, when did this relation get established? And we could trace back the whole journey of our mammalian evolution. From the little amoeba which shrinks from a painful contact, whether it experiences pain in the way we do or not. It is the same instinct which has grown and become more and more sophisticated in the human being. So we have actually a very old habit. But he says, it is within our competence to return quite the opposite response. Pleasure where we used to have pain, pain where we used to have pleasure. But that in itself only shows you that both pleasure and pain are equivalent in choices of response. Neither of them is really the greater truth. So what is the greater truth? It is equally within our competence to accustom the superficial being to return, instead of the mechanical reactions of pleasure, pain and indifference, that free reply of inalienable delight, which is the constant experience of the true and vast bliss self within us. If we are already resting or living in that deeper, vaster, truer self, sharing in its glow or even intensity of bliss, then it is possible that we put forward that response. And the normal reactions of pleasure, pain, indifference fall away. And he says, and this is a greater conquest, a deeper and more complete self-possession. And he says it is not merely a freedom from subjection, it is actually a conversion of an imperfect and false response to a perfect and true value. And the true delight of the spirit in things being more obviously and directly manifested in our own nature. Now he moves to this, how this is to be attained. For the next 3 paragraphs where he discusses the means, 4 paragraphs, he places before us 3 levels of distinction of our own consciousness. There is the mind, which can stand back. There is the nervous being, which is the layer where we have the automatic reaction to any circumstances. And then there is the physical body and nerves, on which mind and the nervous being rest, and which is the means for our participation in the material world. And on each of these 3 levels, different processes and responses take place, which he will now describe. The nervous being in us indeed is accustomed to a certain fixedness, a false impression of absoluteness in these things, that is pleasure and pain. To it, victory, success, honor, good fortune of all kinds are pleasant things in themselves, absolutely, and must produce joy as sugar must taste sweet. And he's deliberately making this correlation, and we will see later we can actually change the taste of sugar And if that can be changed, then obviously even this reaction of victory, success, honor as positive things can be changed. And he says, defeat, failure, disappointment, disgrace, evil, fortune of all kinds are unpleasant things in themselves absolutely, and must produce grief, as wormwood must taste bitter. So when we find in life we made an effort, we were thrown back, we experienced defeat, loss, failure, for the nervous being, it must produce grief. It's an absolute correlation. So I must start grieving. And in fact, if we observe carefully, this is not so true to the mind. But to the nervous being, it's almost like a mechanical imprinted habit. And if we modify these responses, then it is something abnormal or even morbid. Imagine somebody who is defeated and falls with great injuries and starts exulting and saying, "Oh, what a wonderful thing happened to me." We'll say something is wrong with this fellow. Or he has won a great lottery, he has won great accolades, and he starts weeping, saying, "What a sad thing." And we'll say something is wrong. For the nervous being is a thing enslaved to habit. And this is the device that nature has used to fix and make constant the normal transactions that we have as an individual with the world, and to create a sameness of experience that we can relate to each other as human beings and understand each other. If the variations are too great, then we say, "Oh, this fellow, he is from some other planet. He doesn't behave like a human being." So this layer is very important in evolution for precisely creating this commonality and fixity. And that itself becomes our first problem when we need to transform this response. But we will see how that is to be done. Now he looks at the other layer, which is in the mind. How does the mind respond to the same thing? The mental being, on the other hand, is free. For it is the means she has devised, nature, for flexibility and variation, for change and progress. It is subject only so long as it chooses to remain subject, to dwell in one mental habit rather than in another, or so long as it allows itself to be dominated by its nervous instrument. It can meet these things and all things with a perfect indifference. It can even meet them with a perfect gladness. So we have, as for example, in a great battle where the hero warrior finds himself bleeding with injuries, he still gains strength from that injury and the pain and is able to rush forward with enthusiasm and fervor. And what is it that makes it possible? Something in him refuses that automatic reaction and imposes a higher principle. Now, if you look at this in the battlefield, you will find the side, when often there is a battle between two very different values, the side that fights for a greater ideal has as if a greater power of resilience. The side that is fighting for some personal gain or benefit does not have the same resilience. So the person who attacked because he wanted to steal or destroy the other in hate, when he experiences a great reaction, a great force, he backs out. He does not have the strength to face an opponent who is strong. On the other hand, where you are fighting to protect a great ideal, to protect a great truth, then even when you are weak and the other side seems too strong, you find in yourself a greater strength and resilience, which comes from that attunement to something greater than yourself. But what it does is it lifts the center of our motivation into the domain of the mind and above. While in the first case, the center of motivation was in the instinct of ego, desire, and greed, which is normally small and shrinks from opposition, this larger mental or even higher than mental consciousness, it is able to stand back even from great pain, even when it sees certain defeat. It is able to stand back and say, but I live for a greater truth than myself, and it pushes forward. And thus often succeeds where otherwise normally we would have seen certain defeat. So this mental being has this power, and it describes this power and the conditions in which it is able to exercise this freedom. First, it should be the mental being should not allow itself to be dominated by its nervous instrument. As long as it allows itself to be dominated by this instinctive nervous being, well, it is subject to it. But the reality is that it is this nervous being which is meant to be the instrument, mind is meant to be the leader. The analogy we may give is of the rider on the horse. If the rider says, I will go wherever the horse goes, I will allow myself to drift, well, the horse is going to stop, it's going to eat on the wayside, it's going to wander around, he will never get to where he goes. The horse, excited, will throw off the rider cannot control. On the other hand, when the rider imposes on this instinctive energy of the vital being, its higher principle or truth, it can direct the horse and a great thing is achieved. So it is a choice that the mind has to make whether it will allow itself to be dominated by its nervous instrument. And the first thing we need to do is to stand back and refuse to be overwhelmed by the automatic responses and associations of our nervous being. Second, he says, it is subject only so long as it chooses to remain subject. It's a choice. To dwell in one mental habit rather than in another. Why do we have this automatic response? Well, we allowed ourselves to remain in this habit. Did we ever have a choice to break free of the habit? Yes, the self-conscious mind has that choice. Because our rational parts look at our own reactions and say, this is not very helpful. I wish I could do that. I wish I could respond in this way. And even if we do not see it in ourselves, we see it in another person. We see a heroic personality, perhaps one in all of human history, and we say, oh, this is the response I would like. And the mind can recognize this as a greater response, and now it needs to turn upon itself, turn upon its relationship with the vital being, our nervous instrument, and change that relationship. Refuse to be dominated and replace one mental habit by another. So in other words, this involves cultivating a new habit. When transitioning from one habit to another, the first thing we need to do is withhold the automatic reactions of the first habit. And the second, we need to consciously cultivate the other reactions of the new habit that we want. So there's going to be a double process, withholding, controlling on one side, and then consciously choosing and asserting a different pattern on the other side. So, for mind, it is subject only so long as it chooses to remain subject. And so first we need to make that choice. I will not remain subject anymore. I will change. Then comes the changing of the habit and the refusal to be dominated by the nervous instrument. He says, it is not bound to be grieved by defeat, disgrace, loss. It can meet these things and all things with a perfect indifference. It can even meet them with a perfect gladness. So often we have to pass through this passage. From the grief, we can't switch to gladness easily. At first, we withhold the response and there is an indifference. And then we cultivate the gladness. Therefore, man finds that the more he refuses to be dominated by his nerves and body, the more he draws back from implication of himself in his physical and vital parts, the greater is his freedom. He becomes the master of his own responses to the world's contacts, no longer the slave of external touches. So there is a point where we choose to refuse the domination of nerves and body. Refuse to be implicated, that is, woven in and entangled in the physical and vital parts. And to the extent that we refuse that entanglement, we gain greater freedom. And we gain freedom also in our responses to the world's contacts. We cease to be slaves. In the conventional understanding of human psychology in modern times, they look upon mind and emotions as a product of the biology and the physical instincts. And the result is they seek to describe mental and emotional responses in terms of complex machinery. This is true as long as the mind accepts to remain a slave of external touches. But the moment this yogic process starts and the mind begins to separate itself and chooses to assert its own greater truth, that model fails completely. And instead, we find the spiritual truth is that we are conscious, free beings who have chosen consciously and freely to enter this human experience. And we are, as if at first, entangled in the machinery of our vehicle or the vehicle of our experience. But then we learn to free ourselves from the limitations of the machinery and reprogram it, recast it, reshape it in the mold of our own greater, freer, at first mental consciousness and later by the spiritual consciousness. So this is the first step he describes in relation to the nervous being and the mind. But now this third layer exists, which is the body itself. Can such a thing happen even in the body's experience? When the sharp poke of the needle enters my finger, I experience pain in the body and nerves. Then my nervous being reacts with this agitation and anger or fear or sadness, and the mind is pulled along with it and makes a whole story around it. If I change the mind and even train the nervous being to respond differently, the body still remains. Will it experience pain, or can that also be changed? And this is the question he takes up now. In regard to physical pleasure and pain, it is more difficult to apply the universal truth, for this is the very domain of the nerves and the body. The center and seat of that in us whose nature is to be dominated by external contact and external pressure. And it's interesting, it is on the most material level that the role of the body is to be dominated by external contacts and pressures. Mind is meant to be the reverse. It is meant to grow to dominate external contact and pressures. In between is this layer of the vital nature which maintains constancy and some kind of universality of responses. So here we have a very interesting vision of how our personality is organized. But then he points out that even here in the body and nerves, we can get a glimpse of that greater truth, that both pleasure and pain are distortions of a deeper reality. And he says, according to the habit, the same contact can be either pleasurable or painful. So for example, we eat certain kinds of food in different cultures of the world. When we change locations and we have to eat food that we are not habituated to, our body gives a very different response. And after a while, we get used to the new food, and then the body gives a very different response again. At first, this food was too spicy, too hot, it was painful, it caused agitation in my nerves, in my body, in my mind. But after a few weeks or months, I began to enjoy it so much, I was missing the spicy food when I switched to my regular food. And so we find the adaptability where the same response, the same cause can create different responses, not only in different individuals, but in the same individual under different circumstances. We had an unusual experience, just as a passing note. When I was in Singapore, my host there brought forward an unusual fruit. It was smelling strange. He said it's dragon fruit. It's the most delicious, tasty fruit in the whole world. And I saw him take a big chunk and eat it with great relish. So a piece was placed on my plate and it smelled really bad. But he says, don't worry, it tastes extraordinary. So I took a piece and I was overwhelmed by the stench and nauseous with the taste. And then he said, well, unfortunately for you, that's the reaction. But everybody either loves it or hates it, and there's no in between. And he was hoping he could convince me that I could also learn to love it. And after a lot of struggle, I could see how a person could appreciate it, though I never learned to do it myself. But this observation was interesting, that you will find in humanity individuals sometimes within the same family, so with very similar genes, genetic makeup. One individual will absolutely hate that fruit, another will absolutely love. And what makes the distinction? It's not obvious. And it's not biological, obviously. But it is something to do with the way the mind and our nervous being throw out a response built on certain habits, or having got into an initial response, it gets stuck in it, whatever it is. But we see this, that the same thing can be pleasurable or painful to different people or even to ourselves. And according to our state of consciousness, when we are in period of great exaltation or excitement, what would normally be painful is even as if pleasurable. And later, when the exaltation or excitement passes, suddenly now the pain starts affecting us. And we wonder, wasn't this a pleasurable experience a moment ago? We see children often in the heat of the game. They get a knock, you're playing hockey, you get a knock on the stick, the ball hits you, and at that moment somehow it doesn't hurt. And you continue in the enjoyment of the game. Afterwards, the muscles are paining and the place where the hockey hit you is now swollen and the pain is now throbbing. And you wonder why you didn't feel it earlier. Even it happens that you are in pain, you enter the game and now are overwhelmed by the excitement of the game, and during that time the pain is completely forgotten. Your severe headache, your ache in some joint is gone, and after you come back from the game, suddenly the pain returns. And he describes this. In many cases, it is only when the nerves are able to reassert themselves and remind the mentality of its habitual obligation to suffer that the sense of suffering returns. So the nerves tell the mind, hey, you're supposed to feel pain, you're supposed to suffer here. Oh, now it started. I had this experience when I attempted walking on fire the first time, and I walked across the hot coals, got to the other side with no awareness of pain, and having got to the other side, my mind went seeking in the feet. Where's the pain? Where's the pain? And then it found one place which was itching. Ah, here it is. And then it focused until the pain began to grow. And I said, ah, there it is. I found it. And I was looking back at this whole experience. It's as if something inside the habitual nature needed to reassure itself that there is pain. Otherwise, something is wrong. It feels odd. The world is not what I'm used to it being. So there's some part which reminds the mind and the mind gets pulled into it. But this return to the habitual obligation is not inevitable, it is only habitual. And he gives the example of hypnosis, where the habit is changed, where a subject can be told that you will not feel pain, and the needles are stuck into your flesh and you feel no pain. You bleed, but there is no pain. After the hypnosis passes, the pain returns. But also during hypnosis, you could be commanded that you will not feel pain even after you have come out of hypnosis. And afterwards, you see the bleeding, you see the burn and the wound, but you feel no pain at all in your normal state. And he gives this example and he says, the reason of this phenomenon is perfectly simple. It is because the hypnotizer suspends the habitual waking consciousness, which is the slave of nervous habits, and is able to appeal to the subliminal mental being in the depths, the inner mental being who is master, if he wills, of the nerves and the body. So now we are brought back to this deeper person behind. And here he makes a distinction, inner mind, inner vital, and even there's an inner physical. But this inner mental being is master if he wills. And under hypnosis, the surface mental person is, surface mental consciousness is suspended. That's where the normal habitual slavery to the nervous being exists. So that is also suspended. The normal habits are removed and the hypnotist calls out the power of the inner mind to assert its mastery. But this freedom, which is effected by hypnosis abnormally, rapidly, without true possession, by an alien will, may equally be won normally, gradually, with true possession by one's own will, so as to effect partially or completely a victory of the mental being over the habitual nervous reactions of the body. This portion we had read earlier, but I am reading it now in the more complete study of this chapter. And here is the distinction between the hypnotic process and the yogic process. Under hypnosis, there is an abnormal condition, and rapidly an alien will imposes itself on us. We don't have the true mastery and possession of the experience, but something is demonstrated. But by a yogic process, by a process of introspection, even deep introspection that is almost meditative, one can gradually, with normal awareness, enter into our own inner possibilities, with our own will freely leading the way, and gain from there the true possession and effect at first a partial and eventually a complete victory over the nervous reactions of the body. And the habit of the nervous reactions can be thus changed. He then, Sri Aurobindo describes what is the role of that pain. Why at all was this nervous being programmed by evolution to experience pain? It could have from the beginning been a part that develops under influence of this deeper, truer consciousness. And so he explains how the pain of mind and body is a device of nature meant to serve a definite transitional end in her upward evolution. So from the individual point of view, he says, the world is a play of complex shocks of multitudinous forces which are impinging on this individual unit. And because we have limited awareness, limited knowledge, limited capacity, we find ourselves overwhelmed by those impacts of the world. And at a stage where the consciousness has not sufficiently developed, nature imprints the instinct for automatic protection and survival by indicating what is to be avoided, and that is what is registered in the habit of painful response. So nature embeds a an experience or association of pain where we should avoid, an association of pleasure where it is helpful or nourishing for our growth. And thus she leads or teaches the individual who is not yet sufficiently conscious and capable to automatically find its way in the world. If we had to take a modern example, when I program a small toy robotic car to navigate in the world, I have to teach that machinery what to avoid, what is dangerous. I have to teach it what is safe. And so I have to imprint within it, to its sensors, certain responses. And then I can let it free and watch it find its way and learn to understand its world, map it, and grow in its own capacities. But at first, if I did not have those initial protective devices, then very quickly it might destroy itself and would not have time even to learn its lessons. So this is what he is explaining. In the midst of this complex play, the individual stands as a limited constructed being with a limited amount of force, exposed to numberless shocks which may wound, maim, break up, or disintegrate the construction which he calls himself. Pain is in the nature of a nervous and physical recoil from a dangerous or harmful contact. It is a part of what the Upanishad calls jugupsa, the shrinking of the limited being from that which is not himself and not sympathetic or in harmony with himself. Its impulse of self-defense against others. Now comes a very important implication. If our experience of otherness changes, then this jugupsa or the shrinking also has to change. In fact, you will recall in the Isha Upanishad that we had studied earlier, there is this very important statement that one who experiences in his consciousness the oneness with all and experiences the whole universe as his own manifestation of self, how will he experience this shrinking when there is no sense of otherness? And this is the nature of the emergent direction of our evolution. We came out of a crude, flat universality of substance from which the individual emerged. The individual needs this shrinking for protection and survival. But as the individual now breaks out of its mold of limitation and opens to a wider spiritual unity, a greater universality, conscious, even superconscious, the nature of his relationship with otherness changes and the need for the shrinking fades. And therefore a situation comes where the purpose for this pain-pleasure instinct ceases to be. And as we grow into that wider, greater consciousness, we know what is safe for the individual survival. We can see, sense well in advance and act accordingly without fear, without shrinking, and in a right action which balances exactly what is required and not an excessive reaction. So he says, as long as mind is bound in the life and body, dependent on them for its knowledge and means, it needs the support of these devices. But if and when mind in man becomes capable of being free, unegoistic, in harmony with all other beings, and with the play of the universal forces, the use and office of suffering diminishes. Its raison d'être, that is its purpose for existence, must finally cease to be, and it can only continue as an atavism of nature, a habit that has survived its use, a persistence of the lower in the as yet imperfect organization of the higher. Its eventual elimination must be an essential point in the destined conquest of the soul over subjection to matter and egoistic limitation in mind. So mind as it grows, the need for this pain instinct fades, but as the soul emerges and asserts its still greater freedom over mind, then at that point the pain instinct is an anachronism and must eventually be eliminated. But the question can be asked, is it possible to eliminate it? After all, pain-pleasure instincts are so deep-rooted, they are literally identifiable with the machinery of our biology. Is it even possible to eliminate them? And this now he answers, and here provides in this paragraph the secret for the transmutation of our responses to the world. This elimination is possible because pain and pleasure themselves are currents, one imperfect, the other perverse, but still currents of the delight of existence. And this is the secret of all things. All our superficial responses, pain, pleasure, or even indifference, are distortions of the underlying reality, which is the delight of the divine manifestation, the bliss and the consciousness and the very sheer undivided existence of the divine himself. And so if pain and pleasure exist as an experience, they must be made up of currents of that. And therefore it is possible to eliminate pain and pleasure. The reason for this imperfection and this perversion, so imperfection is for pleasure, perversion is for pain. The reason for this imperfection and this perversion is the self-division of the being in his consciousness by measuring and limiting Maya, and in consequence an egoistic and piecemeal instead of a universal reception of contacts by the individual. So the whole problem started when there was first this cutting up. Remember, there was a flat, uniform universality to begin with. The whole universe was this bland, flat emptiness perhaps, or out of that some bland, flat substance of matter. There was no possibility of individualization. When first individuality had to be created, there had to be limiting of borders, barriers, separation. So the moment there is self-division of the being in his consciousness, by measuring out finiteness, and then giving that finite individual a separate identity, that is the egoistic sense, at that point, you ceased to participate in the universal experience of the Ananda. You cut that experience into a piece. And now this piece is struggling against an overwhelming ocean, or pressure of an overwhelming ocean that is crushing it almost. And it has to push back. And at that point, we had the fragmentation and the necessity for a fragmented experience. The recovery, therefore, will take place only when we recover universality in consciousness. So he says, so what's the difference in universal consciousness and individual? What is the nature of the universal experience which gets fragmented and becomes pain and pleasure in the individual? And this is the secret now. For the universal soul, all things and all contacts of things carry in them an essence of delight, best described by the Sanskrit aesthetic term Rasa, which means at once sap or essence of a thing and its taste. So it is the word is the juice, the rasa, which is the juice in the plant, or it also means essence, or also it means taste. Now the fact that it means all three things is very suggestive. And you will remember the discussion we have had earlier, that the divine soul in us as the psychic being enjoys all the world experience always and draws from it nourishment. And if we had to extend this image, it is as if it takes the nectar of all the experiences, draws the juice leaving behind the outer shell that held the juice. So every experience has two components. There is the substance and form and process and associations and attached derivative things of an experience. And then there is the sap which is flowing inside it. The same form of experience could be imitated and repeated with or without the sap. Or the same sap could come through different experiences. It's finally the sap which we have to take. So in the analogy, when you see children eating sugar cane, they chew on the sugar cane, extract the sap, the juice, the nectar, and throw out the pulp. And it is this which happens when the psychic being experiences the world. The pulp is the form and machinery through which the experience comes. It is the sap that it takes and retains. We, on the other hand, as the conscious surface mental beings, we attach ourselves to the form and process and are unable to take the sap. And this is the great difference. He explains this now. It is because we do not seek the essence of the thing in its contact with us, but look only to the manner in which it affects our desires and fears, our cravings and shrinkings, that grief and pain, imperfect and transient pleasures, or indifference, that is to say, blank inability to seize the essence, are the forms taken by the rasa. There's a very profound sentence with many different implications. First, he says, this experience we have of of indifference, he says simply, indifference is blank inability to seize the essence. When we cannot seize the essence, we are indifferent. When we do seize it, then when it is seized imperfectly, we have a transient pleasure. Or if in the essence we have the reaction of shrinking or craving of if we have the reaction of shrinking, then we experience it as grief or pain. When we have craving, we seize on the form, we have the experience of pleasure. But throughout we have missed the essence itself behind. Why? And the reason was, we looked only to that experience for how it affects our desires and fears and our cravings and shrinkings. When I see the food that is placed before me, I am thinking of how it relates to my desire. I was craving for something sweet and I got something salty. On the other hand, today I was craving something salty and he brought something sweet and I am disappointed. If I was craving something sweet and he brought something sweet, I am elated. Except that this is too sweet, so I am slightly disappointed. And so the whole response of happiness or sadness is because I am matching my expectation, need, desire, fear, or craving and shrinking with the thing which is coming. And observe what happens to a child when he first stares at the world, first opens his eyes. Everything is new. There is not yet an obvious relation that has been created. Everything is new and everything is fun and joyous. And at that point, he can get so engrossed in observing ants walking in a line that he forgets everything else. The adult looks at the ants and says, this is dangerous. They might go and eat the food that I have kept outside. I need to cover it. I need to hide it. Oh, I need to put poison to make sure they don't come into my house. We never looked at the experience in itself. We looked at it in terms of our cravings and shrinkings. The child sees the cockroach and is fascinated. The adult sees the cockroach and relates it to his shrinking. Oh, I hate cockroaches, they are yucky. And that's the match or mismatch with their craving and shrinking. And the reaction is set. when we thus begin to review the whole world from fresh eyes and are able for the moment to set aside our desires, our fears, our cravings and shrinkings, and we accept the experience in itself for what it gives us, then we can begin to touch the sap. So the surface personality of our bundle of habits of mind and vital nature, nervous being and body with its programming and habits is stuck in the programming and habits and responds according to those, and therefore experiences pleasure and pain. The inner being, which is not bound to that programming and habit, is universal in its consciousness, meets the universality of the universe with its own universality, and accepts each experience for what it is, as a touch of the divine meeting the divine, manifesting a facet, aspect, ripple or wave of the divine delight or bliss, and it accepts and receives that and enjoys it. Even though the surface mental and sentimental and nervous being reacts negatively because of its habit of shrinking or fear. So he says, if we could be entirely disinterested in mind and heart and impose that detachment on the nervous being, the progressive elimination of these imperfect and perverse forms of rasa would be possible, and the true essential taste of the inalienable delight of existence in all its variations would be within our reach. How can we be sure of this? It sounds right, it makes sense, it feels right to some deeper intuition, but is it within our reach? And Sri Aurobindo gives us an extraordinary example. When we look at this example, we will say, yes, of course, it's so easy. So he gives this example. We attain to something of this capacity for variable but universal delight in the aesthetic reception of things as represented by art and poetry, so that we enjoy there the rasa or taste of the sorrowful, the terrible, even the horrible or repellent. So when we have seen in art or poetry or in drama or sometimes in cinema, even these kinds of things, we look upon them and we can enjoy them and we can enjoy that taste. And the reason is because we are detached, disinterested, not thinking of ourselves or of self-defense, jugupsa, but only of the thing and its essence. So you will see how an art critic will enjoy a painting that reveals sorrow, or enjoy a tragedy as much or perhaps more intensely than even a comedy. And that's because we're observing the drama, the movie, from this detached poise. It's not me, I don't need to run away, I'm not going to be destroyed by the battle and the clash and the destruction that I see on the scene there. It's only an image. And yet a part of me identifies the struggles and the sorrows of the hero and his eventual triumph or failure, and experience his triumph even in his failure, that he could stand up against the falsehood, even allow himself to be suffocated and destroyed, and by thus standing for a greater truth he becomes immortal. And I experience this in myself. And this is in fact the nature of the inner delight behind of the inner being, the true self within us. But the aesthetic enjoyment is not exactly that, but it's the closest we have already of that. So he says, certainly this aesthetic reception of contacts is not a precise image or reflection of the pure delight, which is supra-mental and supra-aesthetic. For the latter would eliminate, so for the supra-aesthetic, for the true being within, the latter would eliminate sorrow, terror, horror and disgust with their cause, while the former admits them. The aesthetic enjoyment, it still allows for this horror and disgust. But it represents partially and imperfectly one stage of the progressive delight of the universal soul in things, in its manifestation. And it admits us in one part of our nature to that detachment from egoistic sensation and that universal attitude through which the one soul sees harmony and beauty, where we divided beings experience rather chaos and discord. So take a historical example of this great person during the war who struggled to save so many people and himself died in the process. And if when he is dying, someone were to whisper in his ear, you know what, your life is going to make a great movie which will inspire many people, he's not going to like it perhaps. And yet, when we are not inside that individual experience and we stand back in a more universal perspective from a distance, we say, oh my God, what an inspiring figure, what a great person, what a great event. Even in the midst of darkness, the light that shines out. And it does affect, it is timeless, it does affect generations after. And this is the nature of, or the closest we can experience of the nature of the universal delight, which sees from a very different vision. But if, and we get a closer idea of this here, if we recognize ourselves in that person, if we recognize ourselves in those who terrorized that person, if we recognized ourselves in all those people that he saved or those he couldn't save, that would be closer to the nature of the universal delight. And there the experience is as if we are not only the spectator and the audience, but we are each of the persons playing out the game on the stage. We are also secretly the director who chose this setting and this challenge and this conquest. And that gives us a sense of the nature of the true universal delight. But this is still a part in us, the aesthetic part, a part of the mind which is able to see this. The full liberation can come to us only by a similar liberation in all our parts. The universal aesthesis, the universal standpoint of knowledge, the universal detachment from all things, and yet sympathy with all in our nervous and emotional being. How that is going to be developed and what it is as an experience is the description of the next few paragraphs which end this chapter. And I propose to take that up as a closure of this study, of this theme, next time. For now we recognize that the basis, the foundation for this whole training and change in our lives is to establish a base of equality, to train ourselves in mind, in our emotions, in our aesthesis, in our nervous being, and eventually even in the body, to respond to all things with a base of equality. And this is best done by turning inwards to that part in us which is already wide and equal to all things. To dwell on it, to meditate on it, to feel it as a backdrop and support, carrying us through all of life's journey and standing behind us as a support in the midst of whatever immediate responses we may have in the most superficial parts of our nature. But he will teach us how that is to be developed and the different directions where that training could go. One direction, he says, it could lead to a path of asceticism. You withdraw and shut yourself in an indifference. But that's not our way. Our way is to lean on that wideness, and in that wideness recover the oneness with the divine bliss. And then we are conscious participants enjoying the play, although free, still participating from that freedom. This will be the direction of our effort. We can meditate on this for a few minutes.